Hello, 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 and welcome to a quick rundown of Victoria 3 Dev Diary number 170, Iberian Twilight and Update 1.12 Changelog. It's finally here, the changelog. This is always exciting for two reasons. One, it means the DLC and update are only a week away. And two, the changelog is always the dev diary where we get to see all of the minor and not so minor changes that weren't part of the previous dev diaries. There really is some interesting stuff here. Considering I did a TLDR video for each dev diary, in this video I'm not going to highlight anything that was mentioned in previous dev diaries. This video will focus on highlighting certain changes that are being mentioned for the first time. This is why this is a dev diary I highly recommend you read as well. There might be some changes I glossed over that you might be like, oh my god, this changes my whole run. So if you're a busy gamer on the go and don't have time to read the full dev diary, here is a quick TLDR rundown of what was discussed. As always, if you want to read the full dev diary, a link to it is in the description. Let's dive in. Now, I know I literally just said I'm going to focus on things not mentioned in previous dev diaries, but this one is so important it must be mentioned again. There is a change to what they call the database entry modes, which is going to break every mod. All mod designers need to update their mods to work in 1.12. It mentions the devs have reached out to mod creators and gave them the tools to fix their mods so that they can be ready for the release of 1.12. So hopefully your favorite mod will have an update. But it's worth noting that all mods need to be updated to work with 1.12. It's time for one of my favorite parts of any dev diary, the list of new achievements. We start with achievements that come with the paid DLC Iberian Twilight. We start with the Spanish Lake. As Spain, complete the Reconquista journal entry. Next, we have Regeneration. As Spain, complete the economic regeneration journal entry without reducing objectives or employing creative accounting. Can we just take a moment to admire the absolute brilliance of this achievement icon? It's a good reminder that it's worth looking at all the icons on the full list of achievements because the references are great. Next, we have the Most United Kingdom. As Portugal, have a personal union with both Brazil and Spain. One more time. As the Philippines, rebuild the Manila Cathedral after an earthquake. Once again, achievement icon achieved. And lastly, for the DLC, Full Circle. Starting as Spain, win the Carlist Wars, and then elect the Carlist candidate after the Glorious Revolution. Now we have the achievements coming with the free 1.12 update. First up, we have Sugar Rush. As Cuba, have a 25% share of global sugar exports and a total export volume of over 2,000 units. I'm coming for this one first, as the first Iberian Twilight streaming series will be with Cuba. And of course, excellence and achievement icon achieved. A las barricades. As Spain, switch to an anarchist revolution or secession and win the ensuing conflict. Deconquista. As any Muslim country, convert Spain to Islam. Challenge accepted. Portugal is not a small country. As Portugal, own at least 12 states in Africa and establish a direct land connection between Angola and Mozambique. And lastly, an offer you can't refuse. Starting with at least 2 non-marginal interest groups opposing a law, remove all opposition to the law's enactment. Excellent icon once again. I think this is the most references we've gotten in achievement icons in one update. I'm probably wrong about that, but I'm going with it. Before we dive into the changelog, let's take a moment to remind ourselves what new features are coming with the free update and which ones are part of the paid DLC. Here we have the list of free updates. The new law negotiation system, the ability to add amendments to law enactment, the Carlist Wars, journal entries that affect more than one country now being a global journal entry to unify the event. A new system of electoral confidence, meaning the ability to interfere and sway elections and a measure of how confident your pops are of the election outcome, and more. And here is the content that's part of the DLC. Additional content for the Carlist Wars and a general internal struggle in Spain to modernize. Narrative content for Portugal, narrative content shared between Spain and Portugal leading toward Iberian unification, a new power block principle called cultural union, where you will have the ability to change the primary culture of member nations. Narrative content for Cuba, the Philippines, and Morocco, as well as content for other African colonies and Asian trading ports. The new and improved coup mechanic, a new paper map, and new table items surrounding it. Now we're on to the changelog. First, we have devastation is now per state instead of a state region. So your pesky neighbor who is constantly at war and whom you are sharing a region with won't be affecting you anymore. Added support for displaying full character names in the order determined by their culture. A variation of this shows up a couple times on the changelog. Basically, cultures that list a last name first will use that naming convention. So characters from those cultures will have their name shown as last name, first name. Interest groups will now only ever join or leave parties when an election campaign starts. However, the restriction on interest groups leaving or joining parties in government is lifted, so parties can be freely recomposed in any way when the election campaign starts, and only then. The only exception to this is under single party state, where IGs are allowed to join the only legal party at the time. Certain very backwards laws such as serfdom, isolationism, peasant levies, and traditionalism will now consolidate all liberal pops into the modernization movement. More liberal and communist movements will not be available until these laws are removed. This is an interesting change. It sounds like it'll be a little easier to get off of those laws because you'll have more pop attraction to a single movement instead of the pops being spread across a couple, making them less powerful. These two are slightly connected, so we'll do them together. All buildings with allowed collectivization now have a greater chance to self-invest, meaning new autonomously invested levels will be owned by the workforce and have a lower chance to be privatized. And then, under the guild system and traditionalism, buildings now have a greater chance to self-invest, i.e. for new autonomously invested levels to be owned by the workforce and a lower chance to be privatized. These next two are going to be a major change to how the beginning of the game works for you. Under serfdom and manorialism, a certain percentage of arable land in incorporated states is now reserved for subsistence buildings and cannot be developed until the law is changed. Additionally, under serfdom and manorialism, a certain percentage of employment in subsistence buildings is considered protected and cannot be hired by other buildings until the law is changed. It's funny how in these changelogs we sometimes get things like this. Just two simple bullet points, but a massive change. The way the game works right now is you are trying to de-peasant at game start. When you look at a state, you look at the population tab and see how many peasants you have. This is how many people you have on subsistence farms. This is how many people you have to employ in buildings, because buildings will pay more wages than the subsistence farms, so the peasants will move out of those farms and into your buildings. However, now that number of peasants won't be how many potential workers you actually have. A certain percentage of them won't be able to leave the subsistence farm until you get off of serfdom. If you are a country with very low population, and thus a low number of peasants at game start, I'm looking at you, all of Southeast Asia and Western Africa, you might have even less to work with depending on your starting laws. For a lot of countries, getting off of serfdom is relatively easy, so this will be a minor inconvenience. For many other small nations, this might prove difficult. Later on, under the balance section, there is a bullet point that addresses this point right here and gives a little bit of a balance to it. But stress on a little bit. Colonial administrations now have subjecthood by default. Improve the range of laws supported by the modernization movement. It sounds like, for smaller nations, the modernization movement is going to be key. Maybe more so now than the peasant movement. Maybe not. We'll see once the update is released, but it seems there's a lot of emphasis being placed on the modernization movement in this update. Added new interactions for government petitions to request an extension on the timer and to immediately dismiss the petition. This is nice. Many times I'll have 5 years on the petition and I'm like, I got all the time in the world for this. Then 5 years later, I'm still struggling with the previous law enactment. A way to ask for an extension is a nice addition. Now on to some changes to the AI. Remade how the AI allocates resources for conscripts. The AI should be a lot more willing to deploy conscripts if it has no regulars at all. This is one of those things that sounds like it might be significant, or you might not notice anything at all. So the possibility of it being significant makes it worth pointing out. The AI will now default to infantry conscripts if it can't access resources needed for the wanted type in the state they are being recruited. A similar feeling for this one as the previous one. It sounds like they've worked to make sure the AI actually fields an army that makes sense. A much needed change, except for when that army is fighting you, of course. The AI is now a lot more reluctant to accept renegotiated treaties that are strictly worse for them than what was previously agreed on. Yay, no more scamming the AI. It's like the AI went to Paradox HR and said, I'm being taken advantage of here. Lobby opportunity bonus acceptance for treaty articles is no longer reduced or removed when adding additional articles that the AI has a positive acceptance towards. This is a much welcome change. I've found the bonus lobby opportunities gives you has been kind of worthless. Now, when a lobby says they're going to help you get a defensive pact, they might actually help you get a defensive pact. Now on to balance changes. Reduced base company construction and throughput bonuses. With the introduction of executives in particular, they tend to rack up enough bonuses already. I remember when Charters of Commerce came out, my wife joked with me and said, "This sounds like a capitalism update." I said, that's true, and that probably means in the future we're going to get a socialism update to counterbalance it. Considering in this update we can now literally have workers rise up and seize the means of production, and now they're lowering the bonuses companies give you, I think it's safe to say the update is here, comrades. Political movements will now also consider the conscription capacity of the uprising states if it's worth uprising. This is a good change. Political movements turning into uprisings is a great complication to the game, but it is kind of annoying when you get an uprising that ends up being one dude with a potato gun. The amount of free construction countries get now scales against their GDP, with a minimum of 2 free construction at 0 GDP and a maximum of 10 at 10 million GDP. This was done due to an excess of free construction in small countries, resulting in areas such as India developing far too rapidly, combined with the increased viability for small countries to support construction sectors with the lowered employment to 1K. Construction sectors now only cost 25 construction to enable even countries with a minimal amount of free construction to build them in a reasonable amount of time. I find this to be an interesting change and not necessarily in a good way. Looking here at the starting GDPs for nations, most start under 10 million GDP. Many countries at the top of the list start with some construction sectors, but when we get to rank 25th and below, most do not. If the number of free construction sectors scales with GDP, and you get the full 10 at 10 million GDP, that means you basically get a point of free construction for every 1 million GDP, with a minimum of 2 construction points. That means most of these countries are not going to start with 10 free construction points as they do right now, but instead 2. 2. I feel like this is something that's going to be reversed in like the first hotfix. Now we look at the note right below it, added a game rule for whether base construction capacity should be scaled to GDP or not. By default, it is scaled for AI countries, but always 10 for player countries, so that free construction can be reined in without making tiny countries too tedious to play. So for the player, you will still get your 10 free construction points. So it's not much of a change for the player, and it sounds like you have the option to turn this off. Now they do mention the amount of construction points you need to build a construction sector has gone down. You now only need 25 construction points instead of 100. At 2 construction points, that means it'll take you 12.5 weeks to build your first construction sector. And that's assuming you don't start with a hit to construction efficiency. And instead of needing 1,500 workers for the construction sector, you now only need 1K. But the bigger problem is that once you build a construction sector, you start paying for the construction goods. You really won't be able to sit on 10 free construction points for a long time anymore. 2 construction points is pretty much the same as having no construction points. For example, let's take a look at the Netherlands. This is a country ranked 10th in the world at game start. They start with 2 construction sectors built already on wooden frame buildings, so they get a total of 4 construction points. However, their starting GDP is only 2.2 million. That means they'll only get 2 free construction points. So the 10th ranked country in the world will start with 6 construction points, and they'll be paying for 2 construction sectors. The problem is, at game start, you have to build the inputs for these construction sectors before you hit debt. If you have less than 10 million GDP at game start, chances are you probably have a bad interest rate. The start of the game is a kind of race to get your logging camps and cotton plantations built to support your starting construction sectors before your reserves run out. Now it's going to take longer to build those logging camps and cotton plantations, meaning you probably have to build those before the initial construction sectors. A logging camp and a cotton plantation need 200 construction each in order to be built. If you're a country starting with just 2 free construction sectors and you need a total of 400 construction to build just your first logging camp and cotton plantation, that means it's going to take you 3.5 years to build those before you can afford your first construction sector. However, I'm still worried about how AI small countries will progress. It sounds like the small countries of the world are never going to progress at all, which is not great. But I guess we'll see how this plays out when 1.12 comes out. I'm saying this from just reading a bullet point on a list, whereas the devs have game tested this. So I imagine there's a reason it's being added, but I have my eye on this one. The prestige from being the leading good producer now scales against global GDP, starting low and increasing over time so that it can be relevant at all stages of the game without completely overpowering other factors in the early game. I've never thought about this before, but it sounds like a good change. Now, if you're the leading producer of a good and you get the bonus to prestige, it won't be a massive boost in the early game when global prestige levels are low, and useless in the late game when global prestige levels are high. Radicals no longer impact assimilation and conversion rates directly, as it also impacts fervor and obstinance, which in turn impact assimilation and conversion rates. As someone who always has a high number of radicals, thank you. Here's a really interesting one. Marginalized interest groups with at least 2.5% support among political participants are now allowed to join parties. Interest groups that are part of a party are no longer considered to be marginalized, even if they have low clout. This fixes an issue where IGs that were not already in a party would never receive votes and thus never become unmarginalized. This is going to be great. It sounds like once you have voting laws, you'll really be able to get your interest groups unmarginalized much easier. There is no longer a penalty to import trade advantage for lacking interests, making small markets more vulnerable to having their local industry outcompeted by cheap imports. This is a good change for small nations. It sounds like you'll get the penalty for exports. So it'll be easier for a small nation to import the goods they need, but you still have to work to export your goods and make your buildings more profitable. When calculating the penalty to export trade advantage for lacking interests, junior countries in a larger market can now use the market controller's interests in addition to their own. It sounds like this will make it much more enticing to enter a trade league with a larger nation and become part of their market. It'll help you get a farther reach on exporting your goods. Losing wars to recognized powers and going a long time without abolishing certain very backwards laws will increase attraction to the modernization movement. All hail the modernization movement, the future savior of small nations. Reduced the direct increase of serfdom and manorialism to landowners' political strength to balance against the impact of added restrictions on economic development. This is to counter the new rule mentioned earlier, where peasants will be locked into subsistence farms while having the law of serfdom active. So a little bit of a counterbalance here. The section on art is mainly what was discussed in the previous dev diary, and the audio section mentions there will be a new sound effect for the new earthquake harvest condition. The content section is mainly the list of changes mentioned in all of the previous dev diaries. However, there is this one. Renamed the Liberia state region to the Grain Coast and reworked the hubs to be more historically accurate. Liberia is now a dynamic state name for the state region associated with Liberia or an American country. So it sounds like if Liberia is owned by someone other than the United States, it'll have a different name. Added an historical Swedish migration event and historical Swedish law event. Time to load up another Sweden run, friends. Made communist revolutions red on the map by default and anarchist revolutions black. I definitely want to see an anarchist revolution color the map black. there's a section for all the modding changes. I've mentioned before, I've never created a mod and don't know much about modding, so I'm not the most qualified person to pick out the most important parts of this list. If you're into modding, check this list out. But there was also a dev diary dedicated to modding, which is also worth checking out. And lastly, there is a list of bug fixes. I won't go through the list here as they are all small, though no bug is small when you're encountering it. The biggest bug is always the bug you're currently encountering. It's worth browsing the list and seeing if there is something that's been hampering your runs. But I don't see anything of major note. For instance, there's nothing about the random loss of organization to your armies when on a front. But a bug is a bug, and so maybe there's a bug specific to you. So it's worth checking out. And there we have it. The entirety of Iberian Twilight and the 1.12 update. I'm very much looking forward to it. It comes out next week on Thursday, December 11th. I'll be starting a new streaming series that day with Cuba, so check out the stream and let me know which movement named the Modernization Movement is right for you. If you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like and the channel a subscribe. A very special thank you to the channel members for helping to keep this going. I very much appreciate your support. You are this channel's modernization movement. That's it for now. As always, be awesome.